Hi, I'm Frank Shovlin. I'm Professor of Irish Literature at the Institute of Irish Studies, University of Liverpool. And we're here today to chat to the inaugural winner of our new annual book prize, the John McGahern Prize, for a debut book of Irish fiction. We had a strong entry, and we shortlisted that down to 4 books. And those books were then sent to the Chancellor of the University of Liverpool and one of Ireland's leading writers, Colm Tóibín, to pick a winner. And I'm delighted to say that the winner he chose was Love Notes from a German Building Site by Adrian Duncan, who's with me here today for a short chat. So, Adrian, I know that I'm talking to you here from Liverpool and you're in Berlin. And I know that by trade, just like the narrator of the book, you're a structural engineer. And I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about your journey from structural engineer to writer of fiction. How did that come about?
Yeah, I studied structural engineering in Aberdeen for about 1995, and then went through my undergraduate degree, and then worked in Ireland and the UK and Australia and the US through about maybe just over a decade, working on different parts of the building industry. So I was a design engineer for most of that. And a design engineer is someone who sits in a building in an office and designs structures. So they're not necessarily on the building site that often. So the engineering office is a sort of quiet place where designs are made and calculations are done, and work is sort of collaborations are made with the architects and things like that. And then you go to the building site with these drawings for construction, and then these buildings are constructed. And then the design engineer usually visits the building site every 2 weeks to make sure that what's been designed has been built within what's been asked, within the tolerances that have been asked. So that's basically what I did for about 10 years. And then in 2008, I decided, before the recession actually hit, I decided to go back to art college to study fine art. And at that same time, I went out to Dún Laoghaire to study fine art. And then at the same time, I started doing creative writing courses in the Irish Writers' Centre in Dublin. And there was a guy called Greg Baxter who was a particular creative writing class. And I ended up doing 3 or 4 10-week courses over the course of maybe 2.5 years. And at the same time, I was studying fine art at Dún Laoghaire. So I was sort of learning 2 new languages at once. Even though I was 30 years of age when I started all of this, it was a very, very formative period of re-education, I suppose, in 2 new languages. So in terms of the writing, then what I did was I would submit short stories. That's basically what I started doing, short stories and essays, and I started sending them to like the Dublin Review and Sting Fly, and there was a publication that Aoife Walsh had running at the time called the South Circular, so places like that. And my trade basically by doing that. And then at the same time, I was working as a visual artist. And then in 2013, my girlfriend and I moved to Berlin, just because we couldn't afford to live in Ireland any longer. And Niamh had got a job as an editor here in Berlin, publisher. So we moved. And after a couple of years living here and learning the language and learning about the city, all these aspects of the previous 10 or 15 years entered into what became Love Notes from a German Building Site. My experiences on building sites, my experience of learning German, my experiences of learning about art and trying to make art, and my writing experience, which of course underpins all. So that's the basic journey of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the striking things about the book is that there are at least 2 sets of expertise at play for the narrator. There's getting a building completed and all the difficulties of that, from wiring and piping and drilling holes and keeping your boss happy and all of that. But then there's also the expertise of language acquisition, which he's going through, where he's trying to learn German. He's trying to pick up a language. I wondered if you saw an overlap between the trade of an engineer and the trade of a writer.
What's interesting is that when I started learning here first, I would make lists and lists of words, just very, very basic words, let me unlock conversations with people. And I realized that if I imagine that set of words being on a building site, that there would be a list of words acquired over the course of a job. And that list of words would be relevant to activities on the building site. So boring, drilling, picking, lifting, fixing, these kind of basic terms that would be needed by an engineer that didn't speak German to communicate on a building site in German. And at the back of the book, at the back of Love Notes, there's an appendix, and it's an appendix of useful words. And actually, if someone were working in Germany on a building site, this list of words would be really useful in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So I produced this list of words based on what would be required over the course of a job in German. And I realized by looking at that list of words that there was actually a narrative hidden in it. And it is from that sort of narrative, that list of words, that the narrative suggested itself for the building site, for the novel. So in that sense, the two trades of building and language acquisition are inherent. And that list of words at the back of it show the inherence of those two things, but then they also suggest narrative. And it is from that suggestion that the narrative of the book came. And then from the narrative came the love notes and the other notes and all of these extraneous ideas. So there's a very kind of like almost a tree-like structure, roots, narrative, and then extra other elements. And this is what the Paul, the engineer, in the introduction to the book describes. He describes how the book works, and he describes where each thing comes from. And I remember in the introduction he says that this is how it works. But if you find accidental connections outside of this basic aspect, outside of this basic situation, then that's down to your reading as opposed to my skill as a writer. And I would agree with that to a certain extent myself as well, that you're doing things to just relay narrative. And if other connections are made by the reader, then they're entirely admissible, but not necessarily always intended.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, John McGahern, who our prize is named after, has written about the fact that he always feels that it's the reader who completes the book. Mm-hmm. That once the book is published, in some ways it's no longer his business what happens to it, and that each reader will bring a different set of eyes, or a different knowledge to their reading, and that it can only come alive through reading. So, like you say, I think there's a love story in this novel. There's a building site in this novel. There's language acquisition, and I think each will bring his or her own set of skills to the reading of the book. Yeah. You mentioned several writers over the course of the book: Herman Melville, Hans Fallada, Anton Chekhov, and I wondered if you'd say a little bit about your own reading habits, and if there are particular writers that have inspired you or continue to inspire.
Yeah, I think this is something that I've thought about a good bit in terms of not just art making, trying to make art, but also, and indeed trying to make film, but also in terms of writing, is that you have to be careful about taking on too much of the contemporary work, because there are certain industrial tropes and values that are given precedence over what might be actually a good aesthetic decision. So I tend to don't read that much contemporary writing, but I do read a lot of older fiction, and I read a good bit of contemporary non-fiction. So in terms of the two books that definitely kind of struck me as suggesting that writing about engineering could be really interesting was Moby Dick. That was definitely one. And then Primo Levi's The Wrench was the other one. In terms of Moby Dick, when I read that, I was, apart from the fact that it's an astonishing story and everyone knows all about that, but the aspect of it that I really, really enjoyed was that the narrator happily and relished staying with the processes of work. In his case, it was whaling. And the process of tracking down a variety of different whales, and even describing them over the course of 17 chapters. And I realized that actually there's something deeply, deeply interesting about this. It's not just this also happened, the story. This is central to the story, the processes of work. So that encouraged me greatly. And then when I read The Wrench, or The Monkey Wrench as it's sometimes called, by Primo Levi, that's a book that features a chemical engineer and a derrick operator. And I realized in that book as well, that's just staying with these rather dry seeming occupations, that a very, very, very deeply interesting and moving book could happen. So that encouraged me. And I knew that I knew a lot about engineering. So I knew that I could write about it with a particular kind of ease. It wasn't research that I was putting into a book. It was lived experience, and lived experience about an industry that I, on one register, really like, and on many other registers find disdainful. I really don't like engineering, the contemporary building industry. But then there are aspects of engineering that I find deeply interesting. So those are the things that Paul and I might have agreed on, let's say. So those are the two books that were very, very important to me in terms of literary fiction, and that might have influenced Love Notes. Yeah, certainly those two anyway.
Okay. I know you've got a second novel out now called A Sabbatical in Leipzig.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you actually write, how quickly you write, where you like to write. You know, are you a writer like James Joyce, who's happy to sort of do it on the run on the back of restaurant menus, or do you need like John McGahern, a silent room and a wall in front of you?
Yeah. Definitely, I'm always thinking about, if I'm working on a book, or if a book is in my climate, in my mental climate, I'm always thinking about it. So everything in the world is of interest. And it's driven. So, but oftentimes then lots of things are just written down onto the backs of notebooks or into bits and pieces. But the actual writing I do definitely at a desk, and it's the desk in my sitting room, and that's where I sit, I work. Sometimes I write out longhand, but more recently I write directly into the computer now. So the first book, Love Notes, took 5 years for the form to come into being, largely because I hadn't written a novel before, and also because the form of if I'd taken the traditional form of a novel with parts and chapters, let's say, that wouldn't have been necessarily how Paul would have written a novel. And it is his book. So it took me a while to understand how an engineer would write a book, how he would formulate a book. So that's why Love Notes took so long, because I had to, the form of the book is part of the character. They're the one kind of thing. The formal and content come together. Formal aspects and the content come together. A Sabbatical in Leipzig, then, that came very, very quickly. And it came from a line in Love Notes. So there's a line in Love Notes, and I think it's about Paul talking about Evelyn. And it's a very brief line. He says that he's talking about her and how much he admires her as a person. And he says that it hurts for him to think of being without her. So it's a very, very basic line, very simple line in the middle of the book. And it was that line from which the Sabbatical in Leipzig came out of, essentially. So I sat down during June of 2018, and it was just a week after Lilliput had taken my first book. So there was a huge sort of energetic relief at the time. And I sat down for 5 weeks and wrote Sabbatical in essentially one sitting. So working every hour that I could. So that one emerged. And the final form of it changed a little bit because myself and Sean Farrell worked on it afterwards, but it didn't change drastically, from that 5 weeks, that 5 weeks of just energy. And it was a very different writing experience to the first one. That's for sure. So to say that there's some sort of method would be hard to say because there's such different writing experiences. But I definitely think that I'm more suited to the sitting down and just going at it for as long as possible. Anne Enright used a great phrase when she talks about giving birth to a work. And so it feels like sometimes that when you give birth to it, it's like there's something there at least, So that's how it looks like it's going these days. Yeah.
And what are you working on at the moment?
Well, it's funny. I'm working on a third novel now. And there's a photograph in A Sabbatical in Leipzig of 5 workmen on the edge of a bog. And behind them is expanses of bogland. So for A Sabbatical in Leipzig, I've gone into this photograph that doesn't exist, and I've entered into that bogland. into 1950s Ireland, and that's the terrain of the new story of the new novel, as it were. So moving through landscapes, I suppose, and feelings. That's essentially the method, as it were. Yeah.
That's interesting, because one of the strengths, I think, of Love Notes is its evocation of a place, and that place is downtown Berlin. And Paul, the narrator, mentions on a few occasions his childhood and growing up on the edge of a bog. And I know you're from the Irish Midlands, and I wondered what, if any, effect you think that had on you as a writer.
I'd say a huge effect. In that there's a stretch of land, basically. So my father was from Ballyman, and that's where I was brought up, just outside Ballyman. And my mother was from Lanesborough, which is about 15 miles west of Ballyman. And it's a trunk road that connects them, and it goes through bogland. And on one side is industrial bogland, the other side is domestic bogland. And in the far distance, when I was growing up, my grandmother lived in Lanesborough. We used to go there every Sunday. I could see this giant structure of the Lanesborough power station in the distance.
I know it well.
Yeah. And to me, I never did anything about it up until my mid to 30s. I'd forgotten about it all, really. And I just find myself continuously returning to that place because I don't really understand it, and I don't know it, even though I went through it on the road all the time. And it's into that kind of terrain that I just keep returning over and over and over again in terms of these larger works. Because I think it's largely because I feel connected to it, but I can't really grasp, I can't understand the place. And I think by writing about it, I can gain some sort of traction on it. And maybe even gain some traction on, the figure that was my grandmother, or the reasons for a power station, or this kind of thing. The other thing that was really interesting about that piece of land is that the sort of infrastructure on it is extremely visible. So Ireland didn't have an industrial revolution, not in the Midlands anyway. So when all of these really modern systems started appearing in the 40s and 50s in Ireland, they're now still extremely explicit on the landscape. So substations, power stations, transformers, railway lines for peat, all that kind of infrastructure. And to me, when I look at it now, when I think about it now, it has this kind of almost magic realist sort of emergence into a countryside that was hitherto dark. And that to me is an astonishingly rich terrain to go into, because it holds lightness and darkness. But also it holds a type of Irishness that I'm deeply interested in, which is technical aptitude, an aptitude for building, for dealing with techniques. And it's an Irishness that I feel is rarely ever talked about, our ability to make and to do the country. Now, looking at that type of work now, it looks very environmentally unfriendly and all that kind of stuff. But at the time, it was cutting edge bog development, that kind of stuff. And that to me is a part of the Irish early history that I just find deeply interesting. So that's the other reason why I keep going back there. The mysteriousness, but also the techniques as well.
Good. Well, I just want to finish up, Adrian, by warmly congratulating you. At the start of this process, like yourself, I didn't read a great deal of contemporary fiction, but as a result of this prize and the judging process, I've read a lot of contemporary Irish fiction over the last few months, and it's been a real education. And you came through a genuinely impressive field, and I love the novel, and I look forward to reading Sabbatical and to see how your career progresses from here. So congratulations. You've done very well, and we're at the Institute of Irish Studies. We're delighted to be associated with your work, and we wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I'd just like to say that I'm obviously deeply honoured to receive the award. It's an extraordinary honour. I'd like to thank obviously everyone at the Irish Institute and the University of Liverpool, and all of the judges who were involved in doing all of this work. I'd like to congratulate my fellow shortlisted writers, and indeed all of the writers who produced works last year. It's a hell of an achievement producing just in and of itself. And then I'd just like to thank Liverpool Press as well, who published the book and took a chance on me, I put an enormous amount of work into developing that book as well. So I have to thank Ruth in Lilliput, Anthony Farrell of Lilliput, and Sean Farrell, who worked as the editor on the book. My gratitude, I can't overstate my gratitude to them for that. So thank you to all of those people I've just met. Thank you as well, Frank, for the time. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Adrian Duncan, invited very kindly by the Irish Cultural Centre in Hammersmith to do a reading from my book, Love Notes from a German Building Site. So I'm going to read a very, very small section from the book. Seeing as this is going to be out in the UK, this is the UK version of the book. It was published by Head of Zeus last year. So, yes, I'd like to thank the Irish Cultural Centre, the University of Liverpool, Liverpool Press and Head of Zeus, and thank anyone who has tuned in, as it were, to have a listen to this reading. The book is written by an Irish engineer called Paul, who I would say is probably in his early 30s, and who emigrated to Germany, Berlin, during the recession, let's say, to find some work with his girlfriend, Evelyn. The book is written in the first person past tense, and it's made up of 5 different parts. One part is a sort of glossary of useful German building site words at the rear of the book. Another part is the narrative itself. Another part are love notes that go through the book. These are essentially compilations of distractions that Paul encountered while looking for useful words in a dictionary. Then there are a series of notes which are about engineering and about people that he loves or is very close to. And all of this, how these things sort of sit together in the book is explained in the introduction by Paul. Paul sort of explains how the book works at the outset. So I think he would probably see this book as a kind of little machine with a variety of different parts that hopefully come together. So I'm going to read one little section, and it's called Love Note 3. It's near the, I suppose, sort of first third of the book. And it'll hopefully give you a sense of what the book is like. I hope you enjoy it. Okay. Love Note 3. Die Zahl, the number. Das Zahlwort, the numeral. Zahlen, to pay. Zählen, to count. Erzählen, to recount, to tell. Ich erzähle dir davon, was passiert ist. I will tell you about what happened. Davon, therefrom. Therefore. Ich erzähle dir davon, was passiert ist. I will tell you, there, from what happened. One day, I stole away from sight for a few hours to meet Evelyn at an exhibition of minimalist art at the Neue National Gallery, way over west, near the Potsdamer U-Bahn-Platz station. I passed the angular, yellow Philharmonic buildings on the right and walked up to the dark, bunker-like Neue National Gallery. The building, despite its size, crept up on me, its glass frame sitting up there on an enormous concrete pedestal. To the rear was a sunken garden dotted with frozen statues and water features. I entered the building through a door propped open with a small timber wedge and continued across the floor, an empty vitrine. In the distance, a man emerged from below. He gestured me towards him, so I walked to the stairway and descended to the galleries in the lower levels. Evelyn was there, turning from the reception desk with 2 tickets in her hand. She looked excited. We entered a dark room in the middle of which was a 16mm projector on a timber plinth. There were about 20 other people ghosting around. Someone flicked the projector on and the film began to whir. Onto the wall, the arc of a large circle was inscribed by the projecting light. Behind us, other machines clicked into gear, releasing dry ice into the space that puffed across the emanated light, suddenly making the white, inclined surface of this arc apparent. We approached this horizontal form, completing itself in the dark. Everyone else drew closer too, as if we were druids around a sliver of winter solstice light. I whispered to Evelyn, "What's this called?" "Line describing a cone," she whispered back. Someone walked through the projection, greatly disturbing the dry ice universe. Then Evelyn stood to one side of the cone and thrust her finger into the wall of light. It looked as though she was dragging the skin of the object back, revealing a nothingness within. I ventured towards the rear wall and stood beside the slowly completing circle for some time. The projector clattered along comfortingly. People stood in a line, surveying the length of the thing. I thought of the name of this piece, line describing a cone. I approached the projector, closed my left eye, and aligned my right with the lens. The cone suddenly flattened into a tube, one with almost perfectly parallel walls. I considered the implications of this parallax and the distance between the tiny circle inscribed on the film and the filament of the lamp in the projector. I gazed along the tube until it completed itself. The room plunged back into the darkness, and the 16mm film thirstily uncoupled from its mechanism. I stood still, waiting for the house lights to come up. When they did, almost everyone had dispersed, and I could see Evelyn looking at me, blinking. We kissed goodbye outside, and I rushed back to sight. As I sat in the train, surging through the dark tunnels underneath the centre of Berlin, all I could think of was the small circle on the projector film pouring itself onto the larger one on the wall, like one O echoing another. It was then I realised how drawn I was to the idea of the contours of language and words and letters as firmaments that lie across and through the actual word. Bohren, to bore, to drill. Bohrend, piercing. Bohren was the first German word I learned on sight. It was while I was trying to instruct Franz's builders as to what was required to build the lift shaft walls. The place was jarringly noisy that day as I stood in front of one of the older tradesmen, us two shouting hopefully at each other through the din. I scrambled through my dictionary, trying to locate this verb to describe how we'd bore our 3 reinforcement bars through the edge of the slab to connect, verbinden, with the vertical reinforcement mit dem senkrechten Eisenstück that penetrated the first floor slab, die durch die Plätte in dem ersten Geschoss einfuhren. As I uttered these instructions, I found myself miming movements of this kind. For connection, I pushed my fist into my hand. Then, to show the 3 reinforcement bars, I'd stick the 3 fingers of my left hand upwards and interlink them with the 3 fingers of my right hand hovering overhead to suggest their connection to the 3 horizontal bars in the floor slab above. Sometimes, in desperation, we'd scribble a drawing of what we meant onto a nearby column, and in a culmination of all of this, we'd close in on what it was we meant. Whenever I alighted on the correct word, this tradesman's eyes would open a little and he'd nod. He was a patient, clever, precise sort, and we agreed each time we talked over this lift shaft that it was a crazy way to go about building it. Verrückt, he would say. And I'd tell him that it was all part of the previous agreement, the Vertrag. And we'd shake our heads, and usually before I walked off, he put his hand onto my shoulder and looked directly at me and laughed somewhat manically before letting me know that he understood. It wasn't just the language he understood, or the fact that we shared a comprehension of the poor planning that had gone into this part of the structure. It was as if he understood far more. Ich verstehe, he would say. Okay, well, that's that section of the book. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for listening in. Okay.